Chelsey and I just got back from what we called a vision trip. And we actually got to go behind the scenes with a handful of businesses it just felt like an incredible opportunity. We went behind the scenes with Chick-fil-A, Tyler Perry Studios out in Atlanta, Georgia. We get to hang out with John Maxwell for 3 days, and we get to spend some time with Bernice King, daughter of Martin Luther King Jr. I mean, like, talk about big visionaries, people that are doing huge things in the world, have built amazing impact in their lives and in their businesses. And we had to go behind the scenes, ask questions, and it was a really powerful trip. I feel like I wish I could just bring you along on that experience with us. And we're going to try to do that a little bit on this podcast. But really, we want to just share some of the stories that stuck out to us, because I think about all 4 of these visionaries. They're powerful storytellers. And there was really some stories that were told, especially by John Maxwell. He was with us for 3 days. I mean, Chelsey got to eat lunch with him, sitting across the table, with a handful of other people. There were multiple times where he was walking with the group, put his hand on my shoulder, looked me in the eyes, and was, hey, how's this going? Is this valuable for you? Like, I mean, he really walks out the principles that he teaches about leadership and adding value. And that was incredible. I think more than just like him teaching and talking and telling stories, it was seeing him walk it out that was very powerful. And I think when I think of all 4 of these visionaries, really the thing that people talked about most was who they were. It wasn't about their business tactics. It wasn't about, how they ran the company. It was really about who they were and how that showed up, the culture they created. And I think that was one of the things that stuck with me the most, because as we're building businesses, it's so easy to get in the tactics and like, how are we going to do this? What's the org chart? Like all those things. But really, it's like, who are you going to be in it? And that's why I think it was so cool to have John Maxwell as kind of a thread throughout these 3 days, because he really carries that, like, leadership. Everything rises and falls on leadership. So we just thought it'd be fun to tell you some stories that John told us. Each one of these stories has a principle behind it around the topic of leadership. We may go into some other stories from some of the other companies, but I feel like the ones that John told are really sticking with me. And so maybe I'll tell a story and then we'll riff on it a little bit and just kind of share some thoughts. I just hope that this podcast is going to impact you the way that this trip impacted us.
And before we get into the stories, I think as I'm looking back on the weekend spent, especially with John Maxwell, who, to be quite frankly honest, like, I didn't really know a lot about him up until probably like 5 years ago. And I had heard from him through like, oh, he's all about like business leadership and you can get certified in his coaching program, which is true. But then now getting to spend time with him, hearing him speak once at a mastermind, and then really spend these like 3 days with him. I mean, this event was put on by him. He really cares about cultivating, creating incredible experiences for people. And he definitely did that. But I don't know if you've ever been around somebody where you can just tell that you like almost hang on every word that they say because it's so good. Like, he truly lives out what he is saying. And the stories are just incredible, where you are just constantly taking notes, and the relationships that he has built, the impact that he's creating, and not just the impact. I think we can get caught up in, Steve and I care about entrepreneurship and business, but it's really about like leadership in your home, leadership in your community, and just knowing that he like really walks out what he says. And Steve and I talk about often in entrepreneurship and every business that we run, it's been about legacy. And I think we would often say like leaving behind something, but it's not just about leaving behind something. It's about legacy. It becomes this like extension that continues after you're gone.
Yeah, he said like, it's not what you leave behind, it's what you leave in someone, right? And I think
that continues.
Yeah, that continues on. It just like continually. And we saw this like so much, even with like one of the business we went behind the scenes with Chick-fil-A, right? And they walked us into an area that was like a replica of one of his first ever restaurants, which is not called Chick-fil-A, it's called the Dwarf House, right? And it was this like tiny little diner. You walk in there and Truett Cathy, like Grandpa Truett, right? Back then, he wasn't Grandpa Truett, but back then he was behind the grill. He was grilling, and they had an audio recording of him serving those customers. And the same things that he carried then, you could see all the way through line to today, like where he really cared that the customers could get in and out fast, right? There was a Ford plant nearby. He knew they had 30 minutes to get lunch, and it'd take them 5-10 minutes to walk over there. And so he knew like, if they order something, they need it in 2-3 minutes, and they need to be able to get out of there. And you could hear him talking to people like, hey, it'll be there very soon. Hey, don't worry about it. Pay next time. I know you're in a hurry. Like, and you go to a Chick-fil-A drive-through and they have like industry leading drive-through times, right? Because he cared about serving the customer in that way and making it convenient, right? And so again, that's more a trivial business thing, but you could even see down to like people talked about, he would always pick up trash, right? He would always just be walking around and he'd see trash and he'd be like, this is God's good earth. And he'd pick up the trash and he'd throw it away. That's stewardship, right? That's what we call stewardship, taking care of things. And you see that concept of stewardship used all throughout his business. It's actually how they came up with the chicken sandwich. I think this is just one of the fun stories about the history of Chick-fil-A, is that, he was a Depression era guy. He loved a good deal, right? He loved saving money, and he made friends with the guy that was making the chicken for Delta Airlines at the time, which had a big hub out of Atlanta. And the guy, of course, these plain meals, you have to have the chicken breast fit in those little trays. And he had a batch of chicken that was just too big to fit in the tray. And so he made a deal, right, with Truett, Kathy, founder of Chick-fil-A, and said, hey, I'll sell you this chicken at a great savings because they're too big. I can't sell them to Delta. It's a lot of chicken. But if you figure out how to sell it, then, it'd be a great deal. Right. And so he didn't pass up that deal. He took it. And that's what honestly led to the invention of the chicken sandwich that we know Chick-fil-A for to this day, because he had this massive, order of chicken, great deal, but then he stewarded it and he made chicken over and over and over until he really perfected that recipe. And the customer said, this is it. Don't change it. And that's what led to the chicken sandwich today. So just one of those stories of like picking up trash, stewardship, to like taking a resource that's handed to you, right, at a deal, and stewarding it, multiplying it, and making it something even greater. That's just who he was.
As I think back on this trip, one of, I think, the core memories that I'm reminded of is just being in this small little room at the Martin Luther King Jr. center right in the heart of Atlanta, where so many historical moments took place. And John Maxwell is interviewing Bernice King, who is Martin Luther King Jr.'s daughter, who is essentially taking and making sure that her dad's legacy and the stories and the events that took place continue on. And I was just so humbled and honored to be in this small room with her and with John Maxwell interviewing her. I feel like it was one of those moments in time where you're I feel like this is a once in a lifetime experience, because, John Maxwell, he's not getting crazy younger right now. He's still active and touring around, but for him to be able to sit across and knowing Bernice King and interviewing her and the wisdom that she had. And I think about Martin Luther King. One of the things that I think has stuck with me is, he was one of the most hated men in the world, at his time. He was assassinated. He was standing for something that he believed in. He was so hated. But then now you think of him, and you can go around the entire world. Bernice was saying that you could go around the entire world and people will recognize his speech. I have a dream speech. Anybody in the world will be able to know that that's Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech that he gave. How powerful is that? And now you think about him and he's so loved and so such held with such honor, but he wasn't back then. And just how people don't realize the division and everything that was in the country then. And how that has shifted over time to his legacy and just continuing. I don't know. I've just been thinking about that a lot, and just the wisdom and integrity that family has stood for so long and pressed into for so many people. So I don't know. I feel my heart just felt wow, this is such an honor to be in this presence and learn from these two amazing people.
Yeah. And I think one thing that stuck out to me, because John pointed it out, was Martin Luther King Jr. And his wife, they saw JFK get assassinated, right? And MLK turns to his wife and he's like, that's going to happen to me. He just prophetically saw it, where they were going and the friction and the state of the country. He just called it. He's like, that's going to happen to me.
They talked about it. Yeah.
And they chose to continue on knowing that. That one is crazy. They had just no fear of death. They believed in this thing so much so that they were like, it doesn't matter, But then two, his wife, Coretta, truly is the reason that this legacy continued, because she just pioneered this thing. There was she just kept the momentum going, wrote a book, she'd be meeting with presidents, prime ministers, all these things, influencing the influencers with this message and keeping it going. So it didn't just stop with MLK. But her daughter, growing up in that household, I think two things that stuck out to me that I was like, that was good. And I want to take that for us. She said, one, my mom, she said, I always knew I was first with my mom. She could be talking to a president, talking to a prime minister, but if I called her, my mom said, hey, wait a second, my baby's calling, right? And that was so powerful. Like the kids were always first. She said my mom was definitely busy, lived a very full life,
was gone a lot,
right?
Yeah.
But like she knew that she was always first. And then the second thing that I thought was so powerful, and we heard this, on a previous vision trip we did with the founder of Hobby Lobby, that words and what you say to your family is so important. Because again, legacy is not really what we leave behind, it's what we leave in people. And she said my mom would constantly remind us of our family's calling, is what she said at the dinner table. So like at the dinner table, it wasn't, I mean, of course you got the day-to-day talk and like, how was your day and all those things, but she would use that opportunity to continually bring up, this is what our family carries. Like, this is what we're about as a family. And like, it doesn't matter if you, of course, growing up, underneath a parent that's famous, right? Like, and a world leader, like that can be pretty intimidating for kids. So she would always remind them, like, you don't need to be me. You don't need to be your dad. Like you be you, but like, this is what our family carries. And like, just reminding your kids of like the legacy that you are carrying, I think is so powerful. And just getting stories and telling stories that shape that mindset, but also let them know like, this is what our family's about. I think that's so powerful because it doesn't matter what your kids choose to do in life. Like everyone's going to have their own flavor, their own pathway, but like them knowing what their like life is like, what is on our family. Like, and I mean, we could do this with our kids and we've started to, but being like, this is what we carry. This is what my parents carry. This is what our grandparents carried. And we're all pioneering this thing, and you got to know that if you're a Diaz boy, you're in our family, we have two boys. It's like, this is a part of our DNA as a family. And I just thought that was so powerful that her mom, she remembered her just doing that continually.
Yeah. And so important too, because oftentimes I think kids of famous parents, whatever, I think that there's probably an intimidation of I have to follow exactly in their footsteps. And how Coretta just released that over her kids and said, like, you don't have to be exactly like mom or exactly like dad and fight for these things and go into this field. But this is who we are together, and reminding them of that, but also releasing the pressure of you have to look a certain way. I think that is really key.
That's so good. So this day it was like, okay, in the morning we were at Chick-fil-A headquarters. Then we went to Tyler Perry's studios. Then we went to the MLK Center. And then the next day, we actually spent the whole day with John Maxwell. And he just was like training and talking on the topic of leadership. And there was a handful of stories that really stood out. He went over like 12 points. I feel like on this podcast, we have time for 3 of them that really stuck out to us as like, wow, okay, that was something. I'm going to remember that story. I'm going to lead in that way. And I need to grow in these areas as well. So the first one that John was really hammering, because he's like, we're going to talk about leadership today, but I really want you to know, like, leadership might not mean exactly what you think it is. He said a lot of people like get ego in the way and they're like, oh, I need a title. Like, I need to be like, I need to be the influencer. Like, I need to be the leader for me to really, truly have impact. And so he just told a story of early in his career. So John comes from actually the church world. He was a pastor before he went into this leadership realm and started training, millions of leaders around the world. And he told the story of when he was a young pastor. I think he was like 19, 20, 21. And he ended up at this church, and there was a more seasoned church, and they had a board, right, of elders. And, it was, an older board, and he showed up at the first board meeting and, like, all right, John, you want to lead, start the meeting with prayers. And he prays. And, then, he's like, okay, guys, like, what's on your mind? Like, he had never done a board meeting before. He didn't know like the logistics or anything like that. And basically that was the last thing he said. Like, he prayed, and then there's a guy, I forget the guy's name, Chuck or something. I don't know. There was a guy who basically took over the meeting and just like led the meeting and just was like, okay, we're going to do this and this and this, and just took over. And then at the end kind of turned to John, like, all right, John, like, pray us out. Right. And then John prayed it out. So John immediately kind of was like, okay, this is how it's going to go. And, he kind of talked about in that situation, you could really do one of two things, right? If you are like, oh, I have the title, I'm the pastor now, I'm the leader. like you could push back against that. Meet with the guy. Hey, we got to do things my way. I want to, be the one who has the voice. But John knew that leadership sometimes doesn't look exactly the way that you want it to look. That leadership is actually influence, right?
Mm.
And so what John came up with to do as a strategy was he ended up going to this guy's farm. This guy was a farmer, a local farmer, and board meeting was on Tuesday, so John would show up on Monday, and he'd show up at the farm ready to serve. He'd be like, "Hey, Chuck, how can I help you? Like, what chores you got going on? I want to hang out with you for the day, help you out around the farm." And he would just work alongside he'd work alongside Chuck. And while they were working, John would just bring things up, things that he wanted to be brought to the meeting. Oh yeah, what about the paint on the front door? What do you think about that? Right? Yeah. Chuck's like, okay, yeah, I think we do need that. And then John would just say, okay, awesome. Like, you think you could bring that to the meeting tomorrow? That'd be great. Right. So he started to basically influence the influencer. Right. And he came in humbly, right? Didn't have to be ego. He's like, this is the system that's working at this church right now. This guy's a leader. I'm not going to try to take him off that place. I'm going to just start working through him by influencing the influencer, right? I'm going to serve him. I'm going to love him. I'm going to win his heart and then influence him, right? And so he would just bring stuff on Monday. And then on Tuesday, Chuck would come, say all the things and say all the things that John wanted him to say. And so John just secretly led kind of behind the scenes by influencing the influencer. And I just thought this was so powerful because in business, in relationships, oftentimes, you want to expand your influence, right? But sometimes the bottleneck can be you demanding you need to be the one, right? So he just said, hey, ask yourself this question: who's influential in my world and how can I work with them, right? How can I love on them? How can I influence them? And still get the same effect, and, I know titles are flashy. I know, sometimes it's like, oh, this person's the president. This is the CEO. This is the whatever. But oftentimes it's not that person who's really leading. Sometimes there's an influencer who is influencing that person and they're actually leading.
Like leadership is influence. There's a couple key things that I wrote down that really stuck out to me and that John has done over and over again that I think we can all do. And he just said to gain like influence, he's like, I've always had mentors in my life. Like John has always had mentors in his life. And I think that is so key and powerful to have people speaking into you. And even on this trip, like I got to sit at a table with some women who some of them I've known a little bit, and we are all in this mastermind together. And there's some women that are more seasoned than me, that are grandmas, that have been in business longer, that have, had highs and lows and everything in between. And those kinds of people I see as like mentors. And I just remember at the end of the John Maxwell event, like getting to sit around a table together as women and just share like, what are our visions? What do we want 2025 to look like? And there was so much wisdom from these women that I see as mentors in my life pouring into me. And so I just really want to encourage you, like, do you have a mentor? Do you have a mentor? Like Stephen and I, we have business mentors, we have spiritual mentors, we have spiritual and business mentors, and then we have, people who are just further in us in marriage and family that we are constantly asking for feedback in, because I think sometimes when you're in a season, at least for me, like I'm a younger mom, you could even say like I'm younger in business compared to people who have been in business 20 years. And sometimes just getting around them and hearing their perspective changes your perspective, because, it's like you don't know what you don't know. And I think often, like, even just getting permission from somebody older than you, like, hey, like I feel out of the ordinary making this decision. And they're like, that's the best decision you could make, and just encouraging you. So John always has mentors in his life, and even wherever he goes, he's always looking to learn and to grow. And I think that's important, is to always be a lifelong learner, that there is always something that we can learn from somebody else. And John will be the first one in the room to like be writing notes and taking notes. So John loves to meet great people, to go to great places and read great books. And those are some of the things that I think is important for having a growth mindset and learning from others and having other people pour into you.
The second thing that really stuck out to me was John saying that you're either a plus or a minus in someone's life. You're either giving or taking, right? And John is big on adding value. I mean, so much so, like I said, he would ask you constantly, how, like, are we adding value? Like, has this been valuable to you? Like, he would just ask you personally. I heard him ask multiple people that. And he gave a lot of tips on like adding value and just like going above and beyond for people. But one thing he said, which he writes about in his book, is that high road leaders, like, they don't keep score. If you keep score, you're putting guilt on someone, right? And people that keep score, they're always unhappy because they think people owe them. They're keeping score in their head. We call this like strings attached giving, right? And truly, to give is to receive. But if you're keeping score, there's strings attached, and it's actually going to make you more unhappy than it is going to be fulfilling. And he told the story of, again, one of these churches he was a pastor of when he was younger. There was this businessman. This businessman would take him to dinner every Friday. He'd pick him up in his fancy car, and he'd take him to dinner, and he'd treat him, and he would pay for the dinner, right? He'd pay for the dinner
Friday night.
Every Friday. Pick him up, take him to dinner, pay for the dinner, pick him up, take him to dinner, all pay for the dinner, right? And John just assumed this guy's being very generous, wants to pour into me, that type of thing. Then, eventually comes time for John to move on to something else, graduate to a different role outside of that church, right? So he's leaving the church. And as soon as he, brings this news, this guy comes to him and says, how could you, I've for everything I've done for you, now you're just going to leave, right? Like, just was like offended. And I was like, in that moment, it was revealed. He was keeping score, right? He was keeping score, and he's putting guilt and shame on John for just doing what he felt like was next. And so John tells this story, just to compare, like, there's a difference between high road leaders and people that keep score. And I thought this was also interesting to say. He said, high road leaders don't keep score, but they do keep track. You remember this? Because he said they keep track because they want to be a plus. They always want to be giving more than they're receiving. And so John just talked about, you can't outgive me, like, we really saw this week where he just gave. And, really truly leads in this way, being a giver, not a taker. And if you're trying to increase your influence, you're trying to increase your leadership in the world, adding value to people is one of the best ways that you can really increase your influence. And I don't know, hearing this, I was really just kind of like, oh man, like, I feel like we do a good job at this. But recently I was just like thinking about a conversation I had with someone who is very influential. And I was like, dang, I feel like I missed it, because I always want to be doing this. Always want to be a giver, adding value. And I honestly thought this conversation was going to be a little bit longer, but it ended up being like a 15-minute thing. And then before I knew it, he's like, oh, I got to go. And he was out of there. And I was just like, dang, like, I spent most of the time talking about me, like not being a giver, not adding as much value as I could. And, I feel like I missed it. Now, I do think I'm going to have another chance with that one, but it's just a reminder, like, if you're wanting to love on people, you're wanting to gain influence, you're wanting to, make an impact, leading with value, being a plus in people's lives is the key. And one other story I shared with the mastermind is this one concept of just adding more value than anyone else. It's completely changed all of our businesses. And so when you take this concept of adding value and you apply it to your business, I mean, if this can take your business to the next level, and it did for us, even when we were in our wedding business, before we had Rainmakers and we did the online thing, we had a wedding business, and I heard Tony Robbins say, how could you add more value than anyone else in your industry? Right? Which I took as like, how could we love on our customers more than anyone else in their industry? And we took that back to our wedding business, and we started really thinking it through. Cause like, when you start a business like that, you can't just copy what other people are doing. You're like, oh yeah, they do 8 hours and they deliver digital product, like photos, like we'll just do that too. But we really started to high level think about it. We're like, okay, what if we gave our brides unlimited hours, right? So they don't have to stress about us leaving and missing those precious moments at the end, right? What if we wrote a magazine and answered all the top questions in one place for them? So they didn't have to like go find stuff online. They could just find it all there. What if we did a timeline meeting with them? And so if they didn't have a coordinator, we can actually plan it out. So it'd be a stress-free day. What if we actually, and we went as far as this, but we were very newly married at the time, but we're like, what if we do marriage counseling? And we actually created a marriage course for our couples that they could go through in anticipation for the wedding and the marriage. And like, I don't know what type of advice we were giving back then, but we were trying, you guys, like, and that's the thing. We just thought outside the box, like, how could we add more value than anyone else in our industry? So then when people saw our prices, which were higher than most people in the industry, they were like, wow, the value is here. Like, this is incredible. And so applying that one concept to your business, it can be a game changer. Applying it to your life can be a game changer as well. And so that one was, for me, was the one that stuck out to me. I was like, man, I just want to be a value adder in people's life. And I want to approach conversations not about what can I get from this person? What can I get from this relationship? And trying to like, have strings attached and being like, how can I give more than this person ever gives?
Yeah. When you're talking about sitting with someone influential and being like, man, like I probably missed it. I know I've done that too. I can think of several conversations. And again, that, it was like, let's get to know each other. And I just remember walking away from one conversation. It's like, man, I talked the whole time.
Yeah.
But I think with that, like,
well, the thing is, like,
catching yourself in the middle of it is okay. In the middle or afterwards is okay, because I feel like since then I've been able to like go back to that person and like add value to them. But I also think in regards to adding value to people and being a plus one, not a takeaway. John Maxwell said this, like, impressing and influencing people are two very different things. And so I think that's important to keep that in mind. Like, we're not about like impressing people with like, look at me, all of this, but we're actually trying to like influence them. And John Maxwell does that. Like when you sit around him, it's just like, man, like the influence and how he is asking, like, he wants to create incredible experiences for people, just like he did this weekend. And he knows that he can do it because he wants to add value, because he's grateful for the time spent away. And I know we've touched a little bit earlier on in this podcast about like legacy, but in regards to legacy, like legacy doesn't end, it just begins. And a legacy is when a true legacy is left, it's contagious and it continues. So I think that's important to think about. Legacy is contagious, meaning people are wanting to be a part of that legacy. So then because it's contagious, it continues. And I just think that's so powerful. We talk all the time about the importance of finding who's for your to-dos so you can focus on your strengths. That's where Fiverr comes in. It's an affordable solution that can help you dip your toe into buying back your time. I'll never forget the first time I discovered Fiverr and realized I could have people help me in my business for as little as $5. Whether you need graphics, design, videos, animation, even music, voiceovers, or cute drawing of your family for an upcoming gift. Discovering Fiverr was a game changer. Head over to rainmakerfamily.com/deals to create your account and get your special hookup. Again, that's rainmakerfamily.com/deals. Another key point that John really tried to hammer in is gratitude. How often as leaders or just as friends do we think of something positive about another person or something that we appreciate about them or something that we're so grateful for? Like, I don't know about you, but I have those thoughts all the time. Like, man, I'm so grateful for this friendship. I'm so grateful for this mentor. I'm grateful for this program. And oftentimes we have these thoughts of gratitude, but then we never actually express them to that person. And John said gratitude is the least expressed virtue, and people need that. And it's just so important to do. Like, we need to express that virtue because people need it. And sometimes I think we create excuses like, they're really busy, I'll get around to it. They probably have people tell us all the time, blah, blah, blah. And I know that when I've been on the receiving end of people expressing their gratitude towards us, it makes my day. It truly does, because you never know what somebody is going through, what their experience is. I think those are like God nudges to be like, hey, actually reach out to them. And for me, oftentimes those moments where I have gratitude towards somebody, I'm often reminded multiple times about why I'm grateful for them. And so I take that as a cue of like, hey, I need to reach out. But I think more than anything from this trip and from what John says, like, I want to share my gratitude the first time and to not have to be reminded over and over again.
The third story that just stuck out to me, he actually told multiple stories in this point, was something he calls getting out of the people pile. Okay, getting out of the people pile. Recently, John, was opening his mail and he got a box in the mail and it was a shoe. it was a Nike like Air Jordan, right? Nice shoe. So I opened the box. There's this nice shoe, but there wasn't a second shoe. It was just one shoe, right? And it said, if you want the other shoe, call me, right? And it had like some kid's name on it, Connor or something like that. So John picks up the phone, calls this kid, and immediately, right, the kid starts freaking out. It worked. I got out of the people pile. And so he went on to explain he'd been reading his books and learning about getting out of the people pile. And he came up with this idea: send John one shoe and see if it works. And so getting out of the people pile is getting out of the average. Like most people, right? Like gather in one place. The people pile is the pile where everyone gathers. There's too many people. Nobody's noticed. Like no one stands out from the crowd. And especially with influencers, you're trying to influence an influencer. You're trying to connect with an influencer. You're trying to lead somebody. You're trying to connect with somebody.
Or just make a memorable impression on people or make like, I call it like piercing their soul, you know, like just like, I don't know, even if you're like at a networking event or a church event or meeting a new friend at the park, like what is a way that you can get out of the people pile and like really connect?
I always think of like, what is a question this person gets asked all the time? And how can I not ask that question? Like you're getting like your haircut. How long you been doing this? Oh, how long you been driving Uber? Like, it's just like, you're like everyone else asking the same question. Like you're not going to be memorable. You're not going to be noticed. You're not going to make an impact. And so like he talked about the difference between being different and being distinctive, right? Like different will set you apart for a period of time, but other people will catch up. Distinctive is something that's like, wow, that was one of a kind. And like, I'll never forget it. And so he told a handful of stories. The shoe one was one of them. The other one I loved was, he told the story of a reporter who needed to interview Warren Buffett for a story she was doing. And so she contacts Warren Buffett's people and, you know, she's able to arrange an interview, but they're like, you're only going to get 15 minutes with him, right? Warren Buffett, one of the greatest investors of our time, he's got a pretty full schedule. So she's like, okay, I'll take it. 15 minutes, you know, it's all I need. And so she flies out there, right? First of all, get out of the people. I don't do it over Zoom. Fly out there. And she does some research on the way. She figures out that, you know, Warren Buffett's favorite drink of all time is cherry Coke. Okay. Cherry Coke. So when it's her time to have her 15 minutes with him, she walks in, goes right up to him and pulls out from behind her back a cold cherry Coke, a glass of ice, cold cherry Coke. She cracks it open and starts pouring it to him. And I don't remember exactly what she said, but it was basically like, hey, you know, Warren, I heard, you know, this is one of your favorite drinks. So I thought as I'd interview you, I would just bring you something that you loved. Right. And immediately, I mean, this just opened his heart up. He's just like, wow, no one's ever done this for me. Like, this is like, he's going to remember that forever. And guess what happened? Like, they got talking and he's like, how much time do we have? She said, oh, they just told me, you know, about 15 minutes. And he's like, oh, you know, for you, like, we'll take all the time we need. And she ended up getting an hour and a half with Warren Buffett. Right? Like, how much did that cost her? A little bit of time of research and like $5, $10 for the cherry Coke. Not much, but it got her out of the people pile. He does 15-minute interviews all day long. Those people are forgotten the next day, but she was remembered and we're still talking about her to this day, right? Like she got out of the people pile. And like, this was such a powerful reminder because, you know, it's not that hard to do this, right? It's not that hard to add value. One, to love on people like in a way that they haven't been loved on in a long time. Like this is fairly easy to do. It just takes a little bit of intentionality to not be boring, right? To create special memories. And I think one thing that I heard John say, I heard someone in my table say about them just as a father, they're just like, I want to be a memory maker. Like I want to be like memorable, right? So that like when people think of me, it's like, wow, like I made an impact. I was different and I influenced them in a way that was memorable.
What Steven just shared in that cherry Coke story, that definitely sticks out for me. I feel like it's a story I'll never forget, and at least creating an impression on somebody and having good conversation and conversations that really draw people out. But I think this could be done in gifts too, and creating experiences. I know that we've really tried to shift from like, how can we create memorable experiences for our boys and for our family versus a gift? I mean, I think those can go hand in hand, but I think we could do that with customers or those that you love. And John really says, like, don't fall in love with boring, create special memories for people so that they remember you. And John has really transitioned that in his life now. Again, he's coming up to everybody at the mastermind, putting his hand on their shoulder and just saying like, how is this experience for you? Like, is this a memorable experience? And beyond that, like John said, he's at the time of his life where him and his wife, they have very special decorations or things around their house. So even now, he's like, the kinds of gifts that he gives are things that can't be bought. So for instance, his wife has collected, I think it's like these different angel statues that are like all around their house.
Yeah,
There's
they're
certain momentums that are really special to them. And so now when he gives gifts, he'll go and he'll get one of those angels and he'll just say, hey, like, this is something that's important to us. Like, we want to gift it to you. And I think that is also another way of like remembering people and gifting something that's impressionable, that is like meaningful to you so that others see the value as well.
So overall, amazing trip. I mean, we just scraped the surface of some of the wisdom and the stories that we heard going behind the scenes with these big visionaries. And honestly, just leaning into the topic of leadership. I think that was the biggest thing that I feel like we could continually grow in. I feel like we've got the business, tactics, and all that stuff. But John always quotes this famous quote that says, everything rises and falls on leadership. Right? We saw this with Chick-fil-A. We saw this with John Maxwell. We saw this with Tyler Perry. We saw this with the King Center. Right? And those three stories really stuck out to us that, leadership is influence. Right? Number two, adding value. Right? You're either a plus or a minus. And number three, getting out of the people pile. Of course, we snuck in some other things in there. There was a ton of one-liners, a ton of things we'll be chewing on, processing over the next handful of weeks, and really, making a reality in our life. So super thankful for this time and grateful for the opportunity, and grateful that we get to share a little bit of it with you guys. So thanks so much for listening to this show.
And if you're interested at all in learning more about John Maxwell, I know for me personally, I'm going to be diving into his books, finding any YouTube or podcast interviews that he's been on. Make sure to follow him on Instagram as well, because I'm not kidding you. I could listen and sit for hours because John just simplifies everything that can be applied. And we're not just talking about being a leader and the head of a company. We're talking about just being a leader in the world, being a leader in your neighborhood, creating influence and positive change. I think that is what our world needs more than ever, is to value people. John values people and loves people regardless of their background and who they are. You can still value people and disagree. So go pick up one of his books, his newest run, High Road Leadership, highly recommend, or any of his other books as well, that you can find all over on Amazon. But thank you so much for listening to another episode of the Rainmaker Family Show. We'll see you all next week. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Rainmaker Family Show. If you're not a part of our mastermind yet, I want to say I think you're missing out. Our heart here at Rainmakers is to create total abundance for you. That's why we're offering a free one-on-one family freedom design session for you, our faithful listener.
Yeah, if you want to hop on a call with our team, see if it's a good fit to build a business that creates time freedom for you, financial abundance, and helps you leave that thriving family legacy. That's what we're all about in our mastermind. You can grab a time on our team's calendar at rainmakerfamily.com/mastermind. Again, that's rainmakerfamily.com/mastermind.